This is my fourth visit to Pacifica. The first one, I guess it must have been 1993 because Bill Clinton was being inaugurated at the time. And they've been spaced out over the years. My friend Joe will know that I don't do conventional lecturing very much. So what will follow will be open weave. I'll break off from time to time to ask where you are. I will ask you to join in some experiential exercises from time to time. I will lose my way, not just my place in my notes, and that you will have to tolerate. The Political Psyche was published in early 1993, and there have been a series of political books since then, which they actually have all of them out there. I've come from Los Angeles, and I want to tell you about the lectures I gave there. This is a good way of introducing me, but doing it in a kind of a way that takes you into my mind and my preoccupations. The first lecture I gave there was on the rationality of political violence. It was a very edgy piece that opened a door and took people to the threshold and to some extent beyond. Although it was very interesting that in a hall of about 75 or 80 people, not one person had heard of the new Black Panther Party. Who here has heard of the new Black Panther Party? Wow, same thing. Well, it exists. The other day, I was in London at the Tate Modern to go to an exhibition called The State of the Nation, which was about black art in the United States after Dr. King was assassinated and after Malcolm died as well. And there I learned something for the first time. But the Black Panther Party had a formal name. Anyone know what its full name was? The Black Panther Party for Self-Protection. I didn't know that. It was absolutely fascinating. And I read its constitution. And I read a lot of other stuff as well. Anyway, the first talk was on political violence. And it did lead to an extraordinary kind of discussion. I was trying to get the audience to talk about understanding why not only there are young jihadis wreaking terrible violence in Western cities, but why the communities within which they lived supported them. And the audience wanted to talk about Trump. And there was a young African American there who was not an analyst or a therapist, and he pointed out that the marginalization of the people I was concerned about was something he was very familiar with, and that all the people in this mostly white, mostly well-heeled audience were casting themselves as victims of the terrible Trump. That was the first talk on political violence. It was hot. The second one was hot, but in a different way. That was this morning. This was about, in part, about the failure of the Jungian and depth psychological communities to deal adequately with the problem of what Jung wrote about Africans. Earlier, in our Jungian world, we've had to deal with the problem of what Jung wrote about Jews, and Jung's anti-Semitism is now widely accepted, and it doesn't completely ruin his reputation. But although Polly Young-Eisendrath wrote in the late 80s a paper asking why there were so few black, as was the word then, American Jungian analysts, not a lot has happened. I think Joe was in the room, and maybe one or two others were in Cape Town. In Cape Town, in 2007, where I said, well, shouldn't we say something about it to a packed room? and nobody said a word. And I'm not used to being ignored. In fact, I can't cope with it at all. So that was the second talk. It was about how can we be so political, so liberal, so progressive, and something is staring us in the face and we don't seem to want to do very much about it. So I've been involved in politics all my life, long before therapy came into the picture. I was a socialist, and I was, for some reason, taken up in what was then called the anti-apartheid movement. This led me to South Africa, where I was very involved in the African National Congress and various activities, and some of you, my friends and colleagues here, will know, ended up in prison. South Africa was a place where I came of age politically, and I've never forgotten what happened there. The first thing, that was in the late 60s, the first thing I actually wrote on politics was in 1986, and it was for the Jungian International Association for Analytical Psychology Congress in Berlin, which was called, I believe, The Archetype of the Shadow in a Divided World. And this was a time where the sort of Brezhnev-Reagan tension was absolutely massive, and there was real fear in the air of a nuclear war in Europe. And I gave a talk about how depressive anxiety paralyzes the capacity for thought and action, and that if you own nuclear weapons and can destroy somebody else, you will get depressed, you will get into depressive anxiety, and you won't be able to do anything about it. That was very, very close to what you were talking about with this sort of numbness kind of thing. This is a very interesting topic, whichever theory you want to use about it, that people become paralyzed. It's a difficult word to use, paralyzed, because there are PC elements, but you all know what I mean. In the mid-90s, I started something in Britain with others called Psychotherapists and Counsellors for Social Responsibility. And I'm mentioning this because I don't think there really is yet a place where people, therapists, people, counsellors, can actually come together in terms of political action. I'm not a great fan of Psychologists for Social Responsibility. It's difficult to get things moving. And the APA Section 9 of Division 39 also has certain limitations. Psychotherapists and Counsellors for Social Responsibility is a very active group. It's not just writing letters or petitions. It does things. It has campaigns to get the government to do this or that, and goes on demonstrations and so on. So I think it's very, very important for people in the Psy field who have interests in the political to do some politics as therapists, not just to do some politics as citizens. The background to everything I'm saying tonight is my good fortune in having done a lot of fairly high-level political consultancy. First with Tony Blair, who to begin with I admired enormously, in the late 90s and into the 2000s, working with the Labour government on public apologies and also on the fate of masculinity when there's long-term unemployment in what you call Rust Belt areas of the country. I don't know whether there was a connection between what I did with Blair, but I then worked as a consultant on both Obama electoral campaigns. It was extremely interesting. The last time I was here in California was in fact actually it's not quite the last time I've done any work in California was 5 years ago, and I was deeply involved with, no doubt, lots of other people giving advice about what to do about that terrible performance in the first debate with Romney, which you may or may not remember. These are very important things that inform me and make me humble, actually, when compared with people who really are out there as politicians, whether they're the politicians of the Obama-Blair level or activist politicians. Also relevant to what I'm going to be talking about this evening was, again, good fortune to work for the financial services authority. It's a bit like your SEC. And I was involved on something bizarrely and mistakenly called their fairness project. I mean, for a financial institution, they talk about newspeak. Anyway, it was a fairness project, but I left. I didn't like it. And the last thing I want to say in this list of credentials, which I hope isn't only showing off, is that I do a lot of work at a high level management consultancy type of stuff with the National Health Service. And I don't know where the doctor is. When you got a reply from Michael, was you, and then Michael replied about how it's the bureaucracy and so on that caused the trouble. The doctors and nurses were fine, or roughly speaking. And as an NHS consultant, I found that a really interesting remark. And I think I said it to you, that we should never forget what Hannah Arendt wrote in 1969 about political violence, where she said that the main source and cause of political violence was bureaucracy. At the moment, my main political interests are in the Middle East, having co-founded something called the UK-Palestine Mental Health Network, which has been followed by the US-Palestine Mental Health Network. And I won't spell out what these networks do. I'll leave it to your imagination. I'm also very involved in what our austerity-minded Conservative government in Britain is doing to welfare benefits, especially if the reason why you can't work is what we call mental health. Basically, anxiety has been removed, depression has been removed as reasons for not being able to work. And so if your problem is that you're anxious or depressed and you were getting money, well, brothers and sisters, you ain't getting it now. Okay. There has been a political turn in all the psychotherapies, not just in psychoanalysis and the humanistic approach, but also in the Jungian world. And isn't that terrific? Or is it? My worry, as I guess a pioneer in this, is that it's become a bit trendy. It's become a fad. And although I'm an enthusiast, I think the other side of being an enthusiast is to be skeptical. I do think that the great difficulty in the political turn is the one I couldn't resist talking about, which is that there are a lot of people out there who are not like us. And so the political turn in the therapies may not really be going to be very effective. And this is actually true of the whole project of linking politics and therapy thinking. I once said to Jim Hillman that he should have entitled that book, "We've had more than 100 years of psychotherapy wanting to change the world, but the world has stayed pretty much the same." And I think it's interesting to speculate, using a therapy metaphor, whether the world turned up for its treatment at all. And I don't blame the world for being suspicious of the politically oriented therapists like me, because the political record of the therapies is not good, whether it's in connection with the sexualities or with doubts about the capacity of certain ethnic groups to benefit from therapy or whatever. It's just not a great record. So I have a lot of respect for people who say this is just over-optimistic psychobabble. It isn't only over-optimistic psychobabble, but if you don't open your mind to the possibility that it might be, then you don't really have the right to sit on those committees and participate in politics at a formal level. I have another slogan. I would love there to be a psychotherapist on every committee, but please God, not a committee of psychotherapists. I think Pacifica is excellent in realizing that when it comes to therapy and the world, the therapists can't do it alone. We have to reach out. We have to beg for admission into political circles, working with people, whether it's in the homeless area, whether it's in the ecology area, whether it's in the area of social and economic justice. We have to establish that there is a need for us to be there. Have we? Well, maybe this place is doing it better than most, but I think it's very important to think about our limitations. Last point of this introduction. I invented a concept called political energy. It doesn't exist, political energy, any more than any energy exists. But political energy is fundamentally neutral. That is to say, it is not necessarily, inherently progressive, benign, compassionate, creative, and so on. Nazis have political energy. The Ku Klux Klan has political energy. Your dreadful president has a political energy, just as much as the people we admire, and you showed us some very current ones. This is what I mean about being skeptical, okay? And the people we see in our therapy rooms are not necessarily people like us. And if there's time, I may talk about how you work with somebody when the material is political, but their attitudes are absolutely disgusting and deplorable from your point of view. This is the big void in our thinking, is that we don't think about getting outside our extremely well-endowed bubble. Political energy is neutral. So I've spent about 15 minutes introducing this, and this is the way I work as a lecturer. I pause now to see if anybody has a response to what they heard up to now. If not, that doesn't matter, I can easily go on. Anyone else? This is just a sort of little pause, a little break to see what you want to say. But make them quick.
Yeah, well, I think it would be important that you define if it's violence directly towards humans or violence towards property, because that's a really big difference.
Thank you. It's interesting, isn't it? You come and give a lecture on one topic, and the first two remarks are about another topic, but that's fine. No, I think political violence, by the way, is the red thread that runs through all discussion about politics, not just in the United States. Anyone else got any sort of opening things? Yes.
I actually would love to hear more about how to engage in a relational way with somebody who's in your consulting room, who is obviously sort of, before they come into your room, entrenched in an opposing orientation.
Either I'll have time tonight, and if not, I'll slip a little bit in tomorrow. I better not throw this, so come and get it.
Well, I'm thinking about the privatization, right? The privatization of psychotherapy, which is therefore depoliticized because it's not part of the polis. That makes sense.
Yes. Well, you know, in that reworking of the title of the Hillman Ventura book, people much more scholarly than me have listed as a critique of the title, playfully perhaps, but nevertheless it means something, how many attempts there have been to politicize therapy. There was red therapy, there was the Freud Marx project, there was R.D. Lang and critical psychiatry, and there have been many, many other attempts to do this. And in my opinion, Jung and Freud were trying to do it too. I think in a certain way of reading them, Jung, Freud, and the humanistic pioneers like Maslow and Rogers were really doing a kind of political thing. So this is really not new. That's why it's terribly important not just to focus on why this is a good thing, but on why it hasn't worked. And maybe the privatization of therapy is one of the things to add to the list of why it hasn't worked. Any more? Maybe I should get on. Yeah, can you hold that for me? Thanks. Okay, now we're beginning. I have prepared stuff on 4 specific political themes. And after I've talked about them from the point of view of politics, I'll talk about how one might think about them and work with them in therapy. So the whole evening is a conversation between politics and therapy. Now I say I've prepared 4, but I've decided that there is only time and energy and your capacity to take things in to do 3. And after I've done the first 2, I'll give you a chance to vote on what the third will be. But I'll tell you what the setup is now. Well, you can't talk about democracy and then give a lecture as if the matter didn't exist. You know, but we all do it. We all proceed in the same old way, and I do too a lot of the time, but you know, I've got a fool's license here. You know, I go home. Yeah? So I'm going to talk first about leadership and the question of leadership and responsibility and different approaches to leadership. And so it'll be political, and then it'll be leadership in a therapy context and how therapists might work with leadership. And the second one will be on the economic psyche, economic inequality, and certain thoughts about big economic themes that I don't think depth psychologists have paid enough attention to. So those you can't avoid. The choice is between a section on why the environmental movement will fail and something on the politics of intimate relationships and how that is changing, both as a result of what's happening in Western societies and maybe contributing to changes in Western societies as well. And that's where the body and sex and sexuality will come in. So you will have to choose between talking about nature and talking about intercourse. You see, the point is, it doesn't matter at all what you choose. Okay, it doesn't. I don't care what you choose, but choosing when it comes to what your political interests are is a very good thing to do, because nobody can be interested in everything, or at least not at the same level of intensity. And then I will give I'll try to talk about how you work with deplorable people. But I promise you, if that doesn't happen, I've got 3 hours tomorrow, and we can cover it. I see tomorrow as a much more experiential extension of what this is about. Does my voice sound all right? Yeah. Okay. So, leadership. This is informed, of course, by working with those sorts of leaders, but also with people who inspire activist groups as well. And a lot of it does come from working with the British National Health Service, where my task is to talk with the top people about ideas of leadership. Now, there are basically 2 main approaches to leadership. Neither is necessarily better than the other, although in a room like this, the second one, which we'll get to in a second what it is probably more popular. But in fact, both, in certain circumstances, are needed. Let me tell you what they are without further ado. The first one I call heroic leadership, and the second one, sibling leadership. And I'm not channeling Robert Bly. The heroic model of leadership is the hypermasculine, dynamic approach to leadership with the offer, overtly, of physical protection. Now, you can all think of current circumstances in which this is going on and it's not a terribly attractive proposition, but there are many times in the life of a nation where a heroic leader is spot on and is exactly what is needed. And it doesn't matter what the anatomical sex of the leader is, because for reasons which I'm sure you can imagine, many female leaders have been highly heroic. There is a bit of an issue, though, with heroic leadership, which is that although most people can see that there are times when you need it, everyone talks about Winston Churchill in this context, there are lots of times when what the heroic leader does is to manufacture a crisis beyond whatever the true risk is in order to be able to swoop in and solve it or heal it as the heroic leader. With our heads, we usually know that this is a con trick, that it's not really as it's being put to us. But with our hearts and with our stomachs, and sorry to say with our genitals, these heroic leaders do the business. There is a love affair between even progressive liberal types and the heroic leader, and that's a deep problem, because if there ever is a conflict between the pressures of the mind and the pressures of the genitals, you know which is going to win. So we are all in love with these heroes, even though we all know what Brecht said, unhappy is the land that needs a hero. The second model, and I'm compressing 1 million books on management and leadership and stuff, the second model I call sibling leadership. You could call it collaborative leadership, cooperative leadership, community leadership. Feminist models of leadership express this sibling nature really well. And another example would be the way in which the gay communities responded to the challenge of HIV/AIDS at a time when everybody thought it was only an issue for them. There's something about buddying and sibling interactions at the leadership level that is very, very interesting. Most of us like it in principle. All of us, probably all of us in this room, have experienced the endless discussion, the factionalization, the logic chopping, and the difficulty in reaching any kind of decision. They did some empirical research to see which was the more effective model, the heroic model or the... Can you find a seat? Because you're distracting. I can't. Thanks. Yeah, good. They did some research to try to show which was the more effective when there was a practical problem, the heroic model or the sibling model. It's one of those things, you know, where you give people a matchstick, a paperclip, and a piece of string, and a cannon. And you say, get the cannon across the river, right? And the heroic model means that somebody either appoints themselves or is appointed the boss, and they are going to tell everybody what to do, how to dismantle the cannon and use the bit of string and get it across the river. Get the idea? And in the sibling model, people work together. They don't work hierarchically. They brainstorm. They approach it in a team way. Which do you think works better? Just call it out. Heroic? Any others? Very clever. There is no damn difference. It both work as badly as each other. It's very clever. Maybe you know about this research. It's very, very interesting to see. That's why it's awfully important not to privilege heroic over sibling or sibling over heroic. Those are the two main approaches. I want to introduce a third one, which I'm partial to because I invented the term, and that is good enough leadership. Good enough leadership. Bill Bradley took my tape on good enough leadership with him in the car. I mean, it didn't do him an awful lot of good, perhaps, in one way, but it was very interesting to see somebody who was a senior, committed politician got the idea of what good enough leadership is. I hope I can communicate it to you. Of course, it's Winnicott, good enough mother, now the good enough parent, but using Winnicott wildly out of context. What Winnicott said was that at a certain point, the initial phase of the baby's existence ended. Bliss, paradise, perfection vanishes, and quite soon too. The room is too hot, the room is too cold, it's too noisy, it's too quiet, people are crowding around, there's nobody there at all, my bottom itches. The perfect fit doesn't last very long. And according to Winnicott, what her baby then does is swing between idealizing the parent or caregiver to denigrating. An initial idealization is, after a failure or series of failures, replaced by a denigration. Now, does that sound a little bit like a comment on leadership? Because it's meant to. The initial idealization followed, after some failures, by a denigration of the parent or of the leader. Hmm? Sorry? Obama. Or whatever. Whoever. In fact, actually, there was a famous British politician who said all political careers end in failure. And actually, Bill Clinton said something very similar as well. So I don't think it's just Obama or anyone. Anyway, the point I'm making is that this thinking of Winnicott, the way in which failure is managed and the consequent disappointment is managed, is a quite interesting contribution to thinking about leadership. It puts failure in a new place. It doesn't just mean that leaders should admit that they have failed or will fail, and that all leaders will fail. That comes into it. But there's something extremely deep and creative, psychopolitically, about managing failure. And this is what I teach in the National Health Service, because they know they're going to fail because the resources aren't there. The thing is being undermined by privatization and the entrance into the British national health of American health companies. It will fail, it does fail, and how do you manage the failure becomes the key political task. I don't want to say any more about it, just to leave you with this idea that good enough leadership disputes the failure-success binary. There's some great quotes about failure. Beckett, Samuel Beckett, told us to fail better, remember? And Bob Dylan, there's no success like failure, and failure's no success at all. Do you know that line? It's a great line. It has absolutely no meaning, but never mind. T.S. Eliot, every attempt is a wholly new start and a different kind of failure. And the Sufi poet Rumi, failure is the key to the kingdom. There is a long, long cultural tradition of looking at failure in a way quite different from the way in which politicians look at it. Now, do you remember the structure of this? I'm now going to switch to therapy, to good enough leadership in the therapy context, and then I might ask you to do a little chatting with your neighbor. Of course, therapists work with failure all the time, and James Hillman wrote the best paper on that topic, 3 kinds of failure in analysis. I think it's their failure, the client's failure, and our failure, the therapist's failure, but we have failure in our sights. But more important, perhaps, than just leaving it with the word failure is something to do with the limits of personal responsibility. Let me explain what I mean. A lot of people feel they should be doing more, whether it's doing more in their family or doing more in the world, in society, in politics. They feel they should be doing more, and because they haven't done enough, it's a quantity thing, they have failed. And you have to work with this all the time. I tried to talk to my father, but I failed. I tried to resume the sexual relationship with my partner, but I failed. I tried to tell my tutor how misunderstood I felt by them, but I didn't manage that either. I tried to do something in my neighborhood, but it was a washout and a waste of time. I'd like to use this therapy better, but I can't. These are the sorts of things that require an approach called good enough. It's not exactly leadership of others, it's about leadership of oneself. And I think this is a very important theme in individual therapy, and it also has a lot to say about the role of the individual in politics. Let me summarize, and then I'm going to ask you to talk to your neighbor for a couple of minutes, because I've got 2 hours. It's crazy, I've got 2 hours tonight and 3 hours tomorrow. They should pay more. It's all right, they're paying enough. Well, we're going to talk about economic injustice in a moment. So, heroic, it's exciting, even if your head says it's dangerous. Sibling, it's what we all aspire to, but it doesn't altogether get the job done. And good enough, which rethinks what leadership is, disputes the binary of success and failure, and puts the management of disappointment at the center of the leadership task. That's the politics. And in therapy, there are variants of that, which I won't bother to summarize again. In 2s and 3s, I want you to do this. I want you to share memories of times when you should have taken a leadership role, but for whatever reason, did not. Times when you failed to be a leader, looking at it from today's point of view. I should have done something. I should have led. This also goes to the bystanding issue as well, by the way. I'm not asking you to think too much about why you didn't, just to share the information about the moment when the choice arose and you didn't lead. Do you get the idea? And you can see the point of these exercises is to ground what I've been saying in something present in the room, if possible. Do anybody not you don't have to like to do this. Just fucking well do it. But if anyone really didn't understand what they're being asked to do, they should say, but I can't believe that wasn't clear. The time when you failed to lead, looking back, you could have, you should have, but you didn't. Okay, in 2s and 3s, 1, 2, 3, go. I don't debrief these exercises, but I do regard them as part of the discussion period, if you see what I mean. I hope you did it. I've no way of knowing, you know. I mean, what I've discovered in any kind of political discussion in the United States, everyone just wants to talk about the president. So, but I hope you did manage to talk about times when you failed to be the leader that you could have been. Because clients talk about this. And you know who else talks about this? Politicians. It's a very interesting, I said psychopolitical earlier, but I'd like to introduce you to a better academic word, the one we have just changed the Department at Essex's name to, psychosocial. Psychosocial is a very interesting worldwide academic thing now. This is a psychosocial question, this question of leadership. Early in November, I shall be using this heroic sibling good enough model to discuss citizens. Heroic citizens, sibling citizens, and good enough citizens. But I wanted to do leadership for the aforementioned reason, because I'm in the United States. Now, economics. It is the central issue of our time. Economics and economic inequality. I wish psychotherapists had made bigger contributions to economic thinking and economic policy making. Even if it would be at a mundane level, like discussing human nature. Is the human being a ruthless, selfish, ambitious, competitive kind of thing? Or is the human being altruistic, gentle, considerate, compassionate, and sharing? Which? Both, exactly, both. This is very hard to make policy on the basis of this. Nevertheless, I do think it's something that we need to talk more about. How you might tip the balance of human nature more towards the second one and less towards the first. But you will never eliminate the market, competitiveness, the possession of Jaguar cars, and all of that kind of thing. The Occupy movement coined this phrase, didn't it? The 1% and the 99%. They were underscoring the ways in which wealth is concentrated and discrepancies of wealth are massive and definitively on the increase worldwide. You don't have to read Thomas Piketty to see it, to feel it. The 85 richest people in the world have wealth equivalent to that of half the world's population. That means equivalent to 3.5 billion people. In Britain, 1% of the population possesses 14% of the wealth. It's the biggest problem. It permeates all discussions about climate change, ecology, species depletion, because the impact of these things is, in fact, delineated and determined by different levels of wealth. I wish, as I say, psychotherapists paid more specific attention rather than simply saying inequality is a bad thing. But let's just think about what we could contribute. That money, wealth, class, these things are experienced very differently according to nation, gender, ethnicity, age, physical health. There isn't just one economic agent. There are a plethora, a plurality of economic agents. And people experience money very differently. I think therapists should be talking more about that. So I'd like to tip this away from politics, because you all know what the issues are politically, probably anyway, and look about what therapists might contribute and what we can work on with people in therapy. First of all, economic inequality is a mental health problem. Actually, doing well can be a mental health problem. Specifically, doing better than your parents, what our psychoanalytic colleagues accurately call Oedipal victory, is a psychodynamic nightmare. However, given the pressure and the betrayal of the middle classes, what we meet in therapy increasingly are people who are doing worse than their parents, which is a massive extra Oedipal defeat. Class is a psychosocial problem. Social mobility is as well. And we do need to open up spaces in therapy to explore this. The example I'm always fond of giving is of the first time I worked with a man who was a banker. Thank God it wasn't the last. Well, we all need some good payers. That's the way therapists talk. And I need good payers too. Anyway, to get back to this chap, he was a working class boy. His father was a coal miner, and his dreams were full of coal mines. And he spoke enviously and longingly of the masculine togetherness of what it was like to work in a coal mine, something that his father had spoken of to him. And he talked about what it was like to witness the closure of the British coal industry, because there isn't one anymore. Now, this is a very commonly met problem, but I don't think therapists get it very quickly, which is that if you have a client who's moved from being working class to being more middle class, a great chunk of their psyche has not left the working class and its values, its estimable values of solidarity and togetherness. So here was a man working in the City of London where there is no solidarity and togetherness. It is sauve qui peut, people, every man for himself. But at the same time, there was a great piece of him that was a coal miner working in dangerous conditions for not very much money down a mine. Now, that's only one example. I wouldn't like to say that there are great proportions of people's practices involving this kind of thing, but what I do want to say is it's good for therapists to get more adept at spotting it. And then there are questions about how economic factors lead to aggression and violence, especially but not only male violence. We can see this all over the West or the North, depending on which language you want to use. The way in which poverty and unemployment do lead to aggression and violence, and those therapists working in the public sector or insurance situations or low-cost or free clinics are working very often, and they're often female therapists, by the way, because female therapists are not as obsessed with earning a big living as male therapists, and so they work in those low-cost and free because they have husbands who are bankers, if you see what I mean. But the point I'm making is that the linkage between violence in society and economic issues really is something that can be raised and worked with in therapy. And here's another topic that I think is very interesting, and that is the depth psychology of inherited wealth. Let's do this. Obviously, not everybody here has yet inherited. Some may never be going to inherit. By a show of hands, who is going to get some money from their parents or has had from their parents? Even, let's just say, above $5,000. Who in the room? Higher, please. And who isn't? Okay. Oh, please. There's always one. Oh, what? Yes. Yes. Okay. So who has or is likely to inherit debt? We don't have this concept in Britain, you see. Debts are written off. Okay. But a smaller group. There was no real point to this exercise, except to get you to think about the therapeutic angle on inherited wealth. For me personally, if I hadn't inherited £5,000 from my grandfather, I would have become a humanistic practitioner because I couldn't possibly afford an SAP, Society of Analytical Psychology, 4 times a week training analysis, even at the price in those days of £5, $7 or $8. But I couldn't have afforded it without the inheritance. And I did a conference in England, and I asked them about this. How many people would not be here without some family assistance? That's how I put it. Actually, yes. How many people would not be here without some family assistance? Don't make it too scientific. It's just to get you thinking. When I do workshops on the economic psyche, and in my writings, I talk about the move from economic sadism to relational economics. And I ask why, when so many people can see that there's something wrong with the way wealth is disposed of in Western societies, why is it so hard for governments to do anything about it? I mean, obviously, a great portion of the population doesn't want it to change, but a great portion you would imagine would, but it doesn't happen. Survey after survey in the Western European countries, I don't have the stuff for here, show that people would pay more tax if they approved of what the tax was going to be spent on. I don't know if that's true here, but it's certainly true, as I say, in all the Western European countries. It's got me asking, when we talk about a more economically equal society, is there something that's going to stop it from happening? A psychological delimiter on economic justice? I think there is. There's actually something that stops even the liberal and progressive and benevolent amongst us, that means, of course, everybody here, from achieving less disparity of wealth. And I'll tell you about this idea anecdotally. In these workshops, and by the way, it's a trick all lecturers do, I'm telling you about something I did somewhere else, but it's bound to be happening here too. I ask people to imagine that they have won or found or received trillions, trillions and trillions and trillions. And I ask them to put aside their good nature, their better nature, and try to sink down and in an active imagination kind of way, find the most shameful and awful things that they would do with that money. Everyone giggles and a bit nervous and so on. There's a silence. And then I invite people to start. And there's always someone who says, well, I would hire the mafia to shoot the bankers. And I say, that's shameful. So I push it. At a workshop in Pittsburgh, when I started to do this, the only man in the room wearing a suit, in those days I wore jeans, the only man in the room wearing a suit got to his feet and said, I'm an attorney and I advise you not to cooperate with this exercise. He was great. We had a beer afterwards. He was terrific. Anyway, somebody, it's in Pittsburgh, somebody got up and said, well, if I have a lot of money, I would buy 500 acres of prime skiing land in Aspen, and I would put a big fence around it so nobody could come in. And I thought, that's shameful, that's sadistic. And then he said in a choked voice, and I'd hire the US Marine Corps to shoot dead anyone who came within 100 yards. And then he burst into tears and started talking about his tycoon father. Now the point is this, if you can get people, good folk, to dig down and fantasize in that direction, you are touching a collective economic shadow which makes projects of equality difficult to imagine succeeding, never mind all the people who don't want them to succeed consciously. It's hard for us to commit to it. Let me give you one other completely shocking story. This was a training analyst who was really cooperating with the exercise. And he said, if I had trillions, I'd find children with whom I could have underage sex. Now, of course, he's no way, never going to happen. But that's what we're really talking about here. There is something about the possession of untold wealth that unleashes the sadist. Okay, now I'd like you to do one more, probably the last, or maybe second to last, little discussion. I hope you're not getting too tired. We've been going for an hour. What I want you to do is, actually I'll talk you through it rather than making you talk to each other. So anyone who is tired and doesn't want to do it, you just sit there and fiddle around. How was money handled in your family of origin? Who had the control of it? Who earned it? Was there enough? Not enough? Did it vary? Were the males supposed to be more knowledgeable, better at it? Was there a lot of envy of other people's material circumstances? How do you manage money in your current family, in your relationship? How pleased with yourself are you on a scale of 0 to 10? where 0 means you're making another awful mess, and 10 means, no problem. This is personal economics. Oh, and the last question is, did you really discuss this in depth in your therapy? Because many people haven't. Not everybody, but many people have not. As if it's something that the therapists don't know that it's worth going into. It's not a failing in the clients, it's our failure to extend the menu of what we deal with. Now, when I have a lot of time with people, this gets quite emotional. Memories about money in your family. It might have been nice to share it with people, but I'm getting a sense that it will be better to keep cohesion for the moment. I'm not asking you to do the fantasy of whatever about your most sadistic and shameful thing if you had trillions, but you've already done it. Or at least half of you have. We've reached the point where, Joe, can you stand up and help me do the counting? You have a choice. You can hear me talk about why the environmental movement will fail and its idealization of nature and the colossal difficulties we face in bringing the green agenda in from the margins, which is a topic I consult with to Friends of the Earth in, oh shit, I'm not supposed to say, you'll have to edit this out. I consult with an environmental organization in London, which is how do you bring the green agenda in from the margins to make it central, because it simply isn't. No matter what you know, and all the books say, and all the conferences, it's just not a central political concern in any country at all. It was in Germany for a while, but it isn't anymore. So that's the kind of thing I would talk about, and I'd tell you some stories about exercises that show that people who are environmentally active are just totally out of touch with what it means to live in the world. Or I want to talk, if I'm allowed, about how different relational styles are a kind of revolutionary gesture with respect to the way our societies are organized, and may have come about because of the way our societies are organized. I'm going to talk about promiscuity, polyamory, the trans phenomenon, but from a political point of view and then from a therapy point of view, keeping to my structure. So all of you who would rather talk about nature as opposed to intimate relationships, raise your hand. And those of you who would rather talk about intimate relationships, it's close. Thanks, Joe. Yeah, I do and I don't. I'd rather talk about both. But see, this is an old lecturer's trick. I've basically covered both. Okay, it's a way of doing it, but I'm going to talk in detail about intimate personal relationships, but I have to find where in my notes it is, because of course I didn't know which ones. Where the hell is it? Oh, here. Right. I'm not going to separate politics and therapy here, because I think they're totally mixed. In the West, we are living in a time of the most extraordinary relational experimentation and diversity, and it is spawning and is spawned by a radical politics. Whether we're talking about same-sex marriage, living together, polyamory, and promiscuity, thoughtful or not, and considering the massive, incredibly sudden impact of trans, which has come from nowhere to dominate the discourse. Salman Rushdie's new book, The Golden House, has vast sections of his confusion. Well, obviously it's put into the minds of the characters, but he's said on British TV he's confused. Trans has sort of come from nowhere. I mean, it's not new, but it's come into mass attention in a very interesting way, non-binary approaches to gender and so forth. Now, all of this, I think, can be understood, and this is a 60s kid thinking, can be understood as an attempt to heal ourselves as we live in an ever more rotten and difficult to negotiate society. Therapists are supposed to be non-judgmental, but they aren't. They're not non-judgmental around infidelity and departures from monogamy. It's not only psychoanalysis that sees the achievement of a long-term monogamous relationship, never mind the sexual combination of it, as something that a therapist should aim at and be proud of and pleased about when they write the case up. When she came to see me, you know, X was alone and been alone. She had a series of short-term relationships which didn't amount to very much, but after 7 years with me, she got married and had children. Bullshit. It is bullshit, but that is how a great many clinical accounts in psychoanalysis, in Jungian psychology, and in humanistic psychotherapy proceed. And the relational world in which I'm very much immersed is no better. It's really around, and this is hypocritical. We're not supposed, as therapists, to valorize and privilege one particular kind of relating over another, are we? But we do. And the one, I think, that we find difficult is promiscuity. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But I want to get into a little bit of the politics of this. Friedrich Engels said that the first class relation was that between husband and wife. Now, obviously, that's 1860, but it's a brilliant aperçu. The first class relation, not the first class relation, the first class relation is between husband and wife, that within marriage there is a property dynamic, and I believe that this still hovers over a great many Western relationships. The problematic of ownership and of property simply can't be wished away. Now to get back to promiscuity. If you look at the dictionary definitions of promiscuity, you will be hard-pressed to find anything favorable about it at all. Words like indiscriminate are used. The buzzword in our world is casual sex. Casual sex is a very interesting term because if anyone has had casual sex, they'll know it's not exactly casual at all. Casual sex is a very deep, difficult, and complex matter. And so I think that the question of casual sex, never mind thoughtful promiscuity, which is another thing. There's a great book called The Ethical Slut, I recommend it. But this whole question of promiscuity is very interesting because it is in the relationship, the human and the bodily sphere, this is where the pluralism lies. This is where the diversity lies. This is, to honor Hillman here, where the polytheism lies. It lies in casual sex. It lies in polyamory, which I'm sure I don't need to define here. There is a long history of tracking the connection of sex to radical politics. The best person to read on this is Jung's great mentor and teacher, Otto Gross, who made the point about the relationship between social and personal change that we have all inherited as the personal is political. It is a feminist approach, but it's also a Grossian one. Otto Gross, for those who don't know, is the character in the film A Dangerous Method who has sex with the nurse, mutual analysis with Jung, and escapes by running and jumping over the wall of the Bergholzli Hospital just outside Zurich. Gross dies in appalling circumstances and is written out of the history of psychoanalysis and Jungian analysis. And yet, as our colleague Gottfried Hoyer has pointed out, Jung called Gross my twin brother. You know? And Freud wrote of Gross, he is the only true genius amongst us. It's quite funny, as there are Journal of Analytical Psychology editors here, ex-editors. Your journal got letters protesting that Jung didn't have a twin brother. They took it literally. But you see, this is very interesting. Why is he written out when at his peak, both the great founders thought he was terrific? Answer, primarily his sexual behavior. And I think that this is something that runs through psychotherapy, and I think we're missing something. I'm not advocating anything, actually. I think what I'm advocating is a rethink about the value of monogamy, a rethink about the value of relationships that produce children, a rethink about the value of relationships that last a long time. I mean, as a therapist, and as a person, and as a friend, I have experienced so many long-term relationships that produce children and are absolutely horrible. They're violent, they're abusive, they stunt people's growth and development, and yet the culture, and we're supposed to be critics of the culture, we join in with the culture when we say that this is the state of affairs to which we aspire. And you are not going to make a revolution from within a conventional marriage. Never mind the sexual combination of who is in it. It's extremely unlikely. And that is why, for hundreds of years, radical political people have screwed around. It's not because they're immature, it's because this is what you have to do if you want to be radical. There's a fantastic book called Love of the Worker Bees by Alexandra Kollontai about the difficulties of combining politics and sex. And there is a huge difficulty in combining politics and monogamous sex. And by the way, this gives a positive spin to the promiscuous behavior of politicians. If you want to be a politician, you have to engage with your promiscuous impulses. And by the way, if you want to be a therapist, the same thing is true as well. So what I'm trying to suggest to you is that sex, bodily sex, physical sex, is also about social change. I'm not saying, in a sort of 1960s hippie way, that an orgasm is the way to social justice, but it helps. And I'll tell you why. Because it's impossible to imagine political eros without co-imagining personal eros. Okay, there is an exercise for this. I hope you understood it. I hope it didn't come over as too mad. But what I'm really saying is that spearheaded by the young, there are changes going on in the area of relationship and sexuality and gender, hate the word identity, that are extremely challenging to the status quo of the economy and the society and the hierarchy, not just what your mother told you shouldn't do. It's bigger than that. Now, I have to say something here because I have spoken about this before. I'm not actually condemning anyone who's leading a straight life. It may sound that way. But what I'm trying to do is to get people to think. And you know something? You can be married to the same person for a long time and it be a promiscuous relationship in bed. We all know about the commonplace of fantasy during the sex act and the extraordinarily, uniquely human feature of people fantasizing about the person they're having sex with while they have sex with them. My friend and colleague Brett Carr did a massive BBC-sponsored survey on this. All of you should be now thinking, is there something wrong with me? I never fantasize about the person I'm having sex with, but people do, and often, frankly, it's about them in a younger incarnation. But it is still a kind of promiscuity. You're not having sex with the person you're having sex with. So I think that promiscuity can take place in a monogamous relationship. But I want to make the other point. For a lot of promiscuous folk, the sex partner changes but doesn't change. It may be a different body, but it's still a body occupying the same place in the person's psyche. So to the many disputes of binaries, I would like to add this one, that there is promiscuity in monogamy, and there's a lot of hidden monogamy in promiscuity, but it's the promiscuous end of the spectrum, the polyamory, and all the developments that we are summarizing these days under trans that carry a huge political charge. And this is a point that therapists need to remember. The exercise is very simple. I think you better do this privately. Well, I did cut my teeth in encounter groups in the late 1960s. So actually, that is what drove me into the arms of my Jungian analyst. There was too much sex in the encounter groups. And the sex that there was in the encounter groups was primarily for the benefit of the leaders of the encounter groups. And you could say, putting it at its worst, I wasn't getting any, so I switched to Jungian analysis. But, Linda, I was an apprentice encounter group leader. Privately, think about lust. My late colleague, the psychoanalyst Muriel Dimon, who you know really well, and I miss her all the time, said sex is a force, not only a relation. That's such a great comment. Sex is a force. Reich knew that. At some level, I think Freud knew that. Well, he didn't have sex and probably didn't have many relationships, but in principle, he knew that. Sex is a force. Lust is the word we use for the experience of sex as a force. Think of the times you have experienced lust. Not necessarily the times when you acted on it, just the times when you experienced it. What it was like, who it was, where it was it stoppable, did it stop? A whole bunch of questions come up with lust. And, because I am a tolerant person, if you have absolutely no memories of lust, that's fine too. It's just not very usual. Remember I said it doesn't have to be carried out. I think Jimmy Carter got it right, actually, with that famous remark about lust in the heart. Are you thinking about this? This is to ground you in what I've been saying about new developments in the relationship field as a political move. I once did an all-day workshop on these matters. Quite a few people, this was a mixture of therapists and members of the public, civilians, whatever. And they said that they had had lust experiences. They'd actually done it, but they couldn't tell their therapists. I thought, what a total collapse of this profession if you can't tell your therapist about lust. Is it because you think your therapist has never done it? Isn't it a bit like can't imagine my parents having sex? Something like that. It's a very interesting and deep thing. I also often play music about this. You got to find somebody to love from the 60s. I think that's really around In those days, we talked about non-possessive relating, but I think that was just too aseptic. We are talking about promiscuity. It's got a long history, by the way. And there's also something I haven't said. There's also a sacred element in this kind of approach to sexuality. If you look at some mystical writings, Richard Zana made this point decades ago, they are riddled with erotic energies and symbolisms. And so I do think that as well as a political line in these new or new-ish or new versions of sexuality and relationship, there is also something spiritual. If you go on those websites that specialize in queer approaches to God, you will find the claim, and I think it's a very deep and interesting one, that God basically is promiscuous because he loves everyone. So there is something promiscuous at the heart of spiritual process as well, and do not ask me why. I forgot to say it, but remembered at the last moment. Well, we've talked a lot about general background, why we're here, about leadership, about the economy, about new styles of relationships, and so forth. I do not want to talk at this point about how to work in a direct but responsible way with political material in the therapy session, but I will do it tomorrow. I think that would just be too technical, if you like. I don't have anything either inspiring or annoying to say about it, okay? Because that's my goal, always to inspire and to piss off at the same time. And I believe there are etymological links between inspiration and pissing somebody off. So I've come to the end. You don't need to applaud. Thank you for cooperating, because we have half an hour, but I think we can probably, after a long evening, stop at 1:45, 10:45, because I think I'm a little tired, I'm jet lagged. It's about 4 in the morning where I am. Actually, what time is it in England? It's 8:30. Yeah, 4 in the morning. Yeah, well, sleeping pills and coffee. So, would you like to talk about any of what you've heard?
I'm curious to hear your brief version of why the environment of the psychology.
I'll do that tomorrow as well. Okay. No, very crudely, I'll tell you I prefer to go by anecdotes than, yeah. I was invited to keynote an eco-psychological conference. There were 250 eco-psychologists there. And something made me ask them, who reads glossy magazines, women's or men's or whatever, who? Nobody. But one woman said, yeah, I read them secretly and feel guilty about it in the dentist's waiting room. And I had a sense that this would be happening. So I went to Selfridge's department store in London, which you may know, sort of like Bloomingdale's or something like this, or Neiman Marcus, Selfridge's. And I went to the manager of the perfume department, and I bummed 150 samples of perfume. And I asked this eco-psychological gathering, who here uses perfume or cologne or aftershave? None. So I said, well, who uses deodorant? Getting a bit nervous. Virtually nobody used deodorant either. And I began to see that my hypothesis was right. These people were just out of it. They had left humanity behind. They probably didn't even drink espresso. By the way, there is a serious writer on these matters, if you want to write his name down, George Marshall, a very interesting writer on this very theme, why this won't work. If people who are active in the environmental movement are out of touch or feel themselves to be above ordinary things. Anyway, I then got these little tubes of perfume, and I distributed them, and they worked in small groups, spraying one another and discussing discussing in the sort of tones you might discuss a terrific Barolo or Cabernet Sauvignon or something like that, what they were smelling, and getting them to focus on the glorious artificiality of what I had asked them to do, an antidote to their glorious naturalness. It was a very interesting workshop. Like all my workshops, it didn't really have a point. But it did provide people with a very interesting experience. But I'm sorry to say the joke was on me, because two people had asthmatic attacks and have to leave the room. It's not very funny, but they were okay. They didn't need to go to the hospital. So that's an example of my thinking. We have just idealized nature and ruled out the city and its pleasures and the pleasures of machinery and technology, and everybody wants to live a life as pictured on the websites of psychotherapists, if you get my point. I'm writing a paper at the moment about the extraordinary nonsense people put on their websites and the dreadful images of the moon rising, or a lake, or a mountain, or a pattern of stones, and all this kind of thing. That isn't where people are. That isn't where real people are. Sorry. It is what therapists would like to be. So this is my mission, is to dirty this stuff up as much as possible. So that is my short answer. But can we have, well, I guess it was a question, so it's fair enough. Any more questions, points? How have you found it? Yes, I've got two hands.
The good enough failure. I think that's something I can use every day of my life for the rest of my life. So thanks for that.
I like, like all therapists, I love it when people get it slightly wrong. No, Alec, I'm deadly.
I said that on purpose.
Yeah, but you invented that consciously.
Yes.
Good enough failure as opposed to good enough leader. Okay, well, I take it back. But it is very interesting in therapy when people get it wrong. I have a client the other day who spoke about Pygmalion. You know, she said, the girl who became Eliza Doolittle. Now, as you probably know, Pygmalion was the sculptor. Pygmalion in Shaw's play was Henry Higgins. But if you're a well-trained therapist, and all of us are, you definitely don't contradict it, you work with it. So that's why I like the fact that you had a good enough failure. But yeah, thank you for saying you got some takeaway. There was this person here.
Yeah, I just had a question about, I don't know if I'm putting this properly, but sort of these different types of sexual relationships, encounters as being almost like a form of political activism in a sense. I feel like I can understand like the younger generations maybe doing it on their own accord, which then have these like trickle-down effects, in decades to come. But I guess I don't have enough of like a personal experience or knowledge of like the other side, like you're saying, the politicians who sort of choose to do it. And I just didn't know if maybe you could speak a little more about that, because I found that a little interesting.
That's a really good question, and it would be reasonable to think I lost it at that point. But I didn't. There is a sex and politics interweave. I'm not talking for those of you who know the history about sex poll, because there was something called sex poll. These things weave in and out. So if I'm going to advance the thesis that certain kinds of sexual relationship may be understood from a political point of view, I have to look at the fact that people involved in politics do an awful lot of sexual stuff. They grab people by the you-know-what and all the rest of it. But you can't only live in the good, in the clean, in the optimistic, in the pleasurable, pleasant, sorry. You can't always live in the pleasant areas. And so I try to be honest, or at least consistent, and I do realize now from all my work on promiscuity, which is published, there's a chapter in the new book about all of this, I do realize that this is something to understand about politicians and their lives as well. And by the way, female as well as male politicians. It's quite an important point to make. So no, I thought your question was really terrific, actually, and I'm glad you called me out on it, and I've tried to explain why I think that promiscuous politicians are exploring some of the things that younger people are doing as well, and always have done. I mean, this is not a new thing. This connection that I'm making between sexuality and politics has been around for a very long time. Probably someone will know that there was some Greek philosopher who thought of it, but I don't. Any more? Yes, there's two at the back.
Andrew, what about sex and power? I mean, you haven't spoken of that directly. You've kind of walked around it.
Well, it's a good point, and I didn't talk about it, but it wouldn't quite fit with what I'm on about. But it is definitely there, of course, and sexual abuse, and whether it's in the family or in the consulting room, we know is all about power. But the difficulty, I'm just trying to respond on my feet. You're right, I didn't talk about it. At the same time, let's see what happens if I think onwards what you've raised. There is a risk that if you put power into the valorization, the praise of promiscuity that I'm doing, that you might smear it. And what I'm trying to do is to make that claim that we are judgmental as near to reality as possible. So you're right. At the same time, I would want to be careful about introducing it into the discourse, because it might lose the positivity. I don't mean positive psychology, the sanatology, the healthiness of certain kinds of sexual activities. But no, this is a good question, and I've got a lot more I can answer you with. Thank you very much for it. Some people say promiscuity is just a game for boys, okay? But it isn't. If you read Catherine Millet's book, The Secret Diaries of Catherine Millet, the French publisher who led a promiscuous life, it's quite clear that this promiscuity is deeply inscribed in many women's psyches and experiences. Although at times, back in the day, in the 60s, when we were living in communes, it did feel at times as if the men were having more fun, but the women were having some fun. And I think that 2017's variant on promiscuity has eroded that fun differential almost completely. But it is worth thinking about it. And by the way, there are very different religious and ethnic attitudes to sexual relationships to be considered here as well, which I don't have time to go into. So you've got me going on all kinds of complexities. But the overall point is that we therapists, as we become critics of and contributors to political thinking in the political public conversation, need to make sure that what we contribute is not just what any minister of religion or journalist could contribute, but actually comes from our work and being as shrinks. And this is very difficult, because the moment you get too psychological, it becomes criticizable as psychobabble. And this is something I think you may remember, I've written about this and talked about this a lot. If I'm too psychological, it's psychobabble, and only Jungians are going to get it. And if I'm not psychological enough, any Guardian journalist can write it. So it's very difficult. But thanks. Yeah, I think you had one. Is it Julia? What's her name? Julia.
Adding to this, maybe for tomorrow, for your thoughts. You talked about promiscuity. And in our rooms as therapists or analysts, understanding what I kind of see is a lot of consumerism, like shopping for shoes on Scruff or Grindr. The implications in terms of just social change on the relational aspects on people's psyches. I think there's a lot of interesting material. Any comments you would have on that, maybe saving for tomorrow or to get you going to
No, I don't
give
think
us
it's
some
for
insights?
tomorrow. I think it's, it's absolutely for this evening. Was it Adorno? Was it Adorno or Althusser who said the only true things in psychoanalysis are the exaggerations? Is the point Adorno? I think so too. Althusser was the one who killed his wife, wasn't it? Yeah. Well, I'm not talking about that. Yes, this is exaggerated. It's hyperbolic. It's not prophetic, what I'm saying. It is slightly exaggerated. I'm pushing it, of course. But I should. It's what I'm paid for, even the small sums. To push it, no, but you've got, when you as therapists, okay, I'm warming to this because we've got 5 minutes or so. When therapists talk about politics and about society, we are poor indeed if we are only sane. Now, when I'm closeted with a political leader or with my national health chief executives and directorates and all the rest of it, I do my best not to be too crazy, but I don't eliminate the craziness altogether. Otherwise, all you get is a conversation that any group of intelligent people can have. Where's the mad edge that comes with talking about therapy? Hence, the missing part of the evening, the stuff on economic inequality and why we'll never have it if we don't address the economic shadow, that hasn't been talked about. But I think it's a very, very important thing to bring the mad bit of understanding in. Of course, when you come to write the papers and books, you have to do it in a more respectable way than I've done it this evening. But I don't think you can do the respectable till you've done the disreputable. So I don't apologize at all for going OTT. Do you have that expression here? Over the top. Couple more, and we should stop. So, by the way, I'm sorry when you came in, I snapped at you, but I just was in the middle of a sentence and I lost it. Okay, well, I'm apologizing. It was OTT.
Okay. So I'm wondering if the edge of madness in this sort of sanitized view of promiscuity is the pain and vengeance and jealousy, and there's a countervailing force there that is so powerful. And I think that's part of what keeps this monogamous kind of thing going. I wonder if you have any idea.
Well, you see, this is often said as if monogamous relationships, long-term stable relationship, didn't have any pain and jealousy and all kinds of sexual stuff. I mean, I have never really understood completely, but this may be my problem, why long-term monogamous relationships are considered the only thing for people to aim at. I'm not now talking about celibates or asexual people. That's another discussion. But in the therapy world, you will not find many writers who challenge the notion that the highest state of the related human being, sexually related human being, is monogamous. Okay, so that's worth thinking about. It seems we can challenge a lot in our therapy conversations, but not apparently this. And this cuts right across, as I want to state again and again, sexual composition of relationships. Leo Bassani wrote a wonderful paper in 1987. He was one of the first queer theorists. And the paper is called, please don't laugh, Is the Rectum a Grave? It's the late 80s. And in this paper, he said that the great gift that homosexual men have given to humanity is their thoughtful approach to casual sex. And although that is over the top, I understand what he was getting at. So it's a very, very interesting topic which we could go into another time. One more, then it will be time to go. Yes?
You know, whether yesterday I was in LA, as you know, and
Yes.
heard you, and today, about the good enough leadership. And yes, well, I can't ask about yesterday, so I'm struggling with this one. I mean, of course, there's no perfect leader, but I'm thinking more like international level, you know, as you know, this is my interest. That some of the mistakes are really grave. a good enough leader is going to fail, and some of the failures can be grave failures.
Sure. And that's true, by the way, in the parental domain as well. I think you've taken the group also to a door. Because if failure cannot be excluded from leadership, then surely the best thing we can do is think how to manage it well. Yeah? You point at me, meaning...
Yes. That's it, yes.
Yes, okay.
I forgot about manage it well, yes.
Yeah, you've got to manage it well. And you do have an interest in international politics. And I think on the international stage, this point about the inevitability of failure and trying to think new things about failure and position failure and success differently and all the things I'm saying they have some potential. So you're absolutely right. When I talk about failure, I perhaps should emphasize I'm talking about serious shit here when a leader fails. But they always do. Not because they're not perfect, but because that comes with leadership. That you won't make it. You won't succeed. Actually, Bill Clinton did say something about this to bring the whole thing round. First time in Pacifica when he was inaugurated. But it took him many, many decades after, not many, but decades after he stopped being president to actually talk about the inevitability of failure in politics. And in my interactions with the Obama team, this is a good note to end on. There was, do you remember, we had that big rally in Chicago. I guess it must be the night before or the day before the voting, or maybe 2 days before. Is it called something Fields? Big, pardon? Yes, anyway, there were tens of thousands of people there. And one of my job became, at a certain point, to contribute to speech writing. And I tried to get him to prepare people for failure. And they said, Professor Samuels, you don't understand American politics, then nobody can talk about failure. And I said, well, take it to the team. He said, okay. And he took it to the team, and I heard, it came back as Obama saying, I'm not perfect, which came directly out of the conversation I had with a 25-year-old Ph.D. in political science from Harvard who said, you can't say that in politics. So it's a topic that I'm very dear to my heart, the whole question of failure. And by the way, is it personal that I live close to failure and thinking about failure and how to manage failure in my life? Yeah, of course. Thank you very much for listening.